Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been extremely interesting a few days, and it's been really nice to meet everyone. And I feel slightly less odd than I did before. So my background, although I'm an academic in science and technology studies at UCL now, I spent the first sort of 20 years of my career in industry and in policy-making environments in the UK government. And so I kind of make it my personal commitment to resist becoming a proper academic. So it's good to actually spend some time with people who swing between the two roles like I have. So it's been really good. So what I'm going to do, I think that what I've got to say is going to touch on quite a lot of the things that other people have said. And what I want to do is talk about this crisis in trust that a lot of people are perceiving. But I'm going to give quite a high-level skip through about 7 years' worth of research. So it's sort of the icing on a very nice cake. So if anyone wants to know more about the cake underneath, I'm happy to discuss it in the questions or to communicate by email afterwards. So yeah, let's go. I mean, I'm sorry about these pictures. I can't see them, thankfully. Well, I mean, certainly in the UK, and I think across the sort of developed world, for many scientists, these kind of comments, you know, the British Education Secretary of State saying that people have had enough of experts has really sent a chill down the spine of kind of lots of scientists and people who are advocates for rational thought and rational decision making. And I think it's understandable. But what I'm going to argue today is that actually what is happening is not a rejection of rational thinking or values or the ideas behind science, but they're experiencing the world very differently to the way in which experts are describing it. And that compounding that, science and innovation policy has completely ignored the really powerful social shaping effects of innovation and technology. Activities that have been put in place to try and enable citizens to influence the course of science and technology have really had very, very limited impact. And my argument, for some reason it's number one again, I don't know, is that if we're worried about people rejecting rational thinking or enlightenment values, we need to take better account of these social issues and more value-based judgments than simply focusing on the kind and quality of science and the public's understanding of science. So, I mean, just to go to the beginning, this is just to me, the convincing evidence that there isn't a crisis of trust. So this is from the British Social Attitudes Survey, where they ask members of the public who they trust to tell the truth. Scientists are the grey line that the arrow is on. And there's been some ups and downs, but basically most of these are a straight line. And certainly for scientists, we're not seeing any evidence of a crisis in trust in science. And this is replicated in most European countries at the moment, it's pretty much a flat line. So, you know, what I'm arguing, this is the more important graph to me. I don't know if people are familiar with this. This is kind of burnt into my brain because it really took my breath away the first time I saw it. So this is a graph, it's actually from the US, but again, most European countries has a very similar chart. The blue line is GDP per capita and the red line is median household income. And what it's showing is that since about 1983, the gap between what we measure and what people experience has grown enormously in economic terms. And to me, this is the thing we should be worrying most about, is what's happening to our world. And it came home really, I mean, I was thinking about this and I was actually on my way to Barcelona to the East conference a few years ago. And this came up in my Twitter feed that the Higher Education Funding Council in the UK had done some research and they had produced this infographic because they were so pleased with their research. And what they were arguing is that for every £1 that taxpayers put into science and research, £9.70 worth of value comes out of it. I mean, in euros, that's probably about 20 cents now, but yeah, so It's a cruel joke on me. I can't afford to go home. Or I'll be a millionaire, I don't know. This is the point. This story that's told about innovation is that there's this gearing effect that a taxpayer puts a little in and a huge amount comes back to the taxpayer's central pot. But at the same time, just further down my Twitter feed was this story from The Guardian. Apple ordered to pay up to 13 billion after EU rules Ireland broke state aid laws. So, yes, sure, that money's coming back, but where's it going? This is explaining to us why this graph is looking like that. The story is much more complicated than policymakers have been telling us and that scientists have been telling us. And then we have people on the street protesting because disabled people can't, they don't have food in their cupboards at the end of the week because they're told that the taxpayers can't afford basic services for people. All of these things are connected, and the anger which people are experiencing is connected. And technology, my point being, technology is at the heart of this. So this is my neighbourhood in West London, and this is exactly where I would be this morning on the best clay courts in London. I'm a tennis addict. But this, I think, is really important because rather than thinking about science and technology and innovation as something which produces products and knowledge, I think it's much more like what's happening here is where, I get to play tennis there. There's a site somewhere here where homeless, so there is the traveller site, where people who don't have homes, who live in caravans, get lived. The worst air quality in London, but we get to use that space because it's spare because of the cars. And this technology is fundamentally shaping the neighbourhood and the city that we all live in. And I think thinking much more around, thinking of technology and innovation much more in those terms is how we get to a clear answer of what's going on at the moment. I'll come back to this. Oh, the other important thing, that kind of rust-coloured building there in the top corner is Imperial College's new technology campus. So I'll say some more about that. And then just so you can work out where you are, I live kind of there, and central London is that way. So we're looking east. Okay, so my question is, has innovation policy actually taken account of the power of science, technology, and innovation to shape society? So this is work that's kind of ongoing at the moment with a colleague of mine in the Netherlands, and we've been developing a framework to evaluate inequality measures, so even whether they're there in innovation policy. And we've been comparing discourses within UK policy and post-apartheid South African policy. And our rationale was that if we're going to find a place where there's a clear political mandate to address inequality through every policy, it's going to be in post-apartheid South Africa. And so far, what we have found are two very different stories and two very different approaches to innovation, although sometimes they look very similar. And in the first instance, South Africa is seeing innovation as the path to equality. So there's measures in place to make sure that as innovation happens, people are taken with them and applications are produced which actually reduce inequality. Whereas there are moves within the UK policy to address inequality, but that's largely because it's about a supply of the workforce problem and creating a customer and a market base. So the answer to the question, has innovation policy taken account of this? In developed countries, probably not, is the conclusion we're coming to. So, so the first lesson that we've drawn together is that, focusing, like cake, in the economy, focusing on the size of the economy is helpful, but it matters how you cut it up. So that little cake is rubbish, but so is the little slice of cake. Nobody wants that. So size as well as spread matters when we're thinking about innovation policy. So the second issue is that moves to involve the public in decisions about science have had little impact on policy. Now, I know that this is... We always come back to talking about more participatory exercises. And in the UK, we've had almost 15 years of the ScienceWise programme where citizens have been linked to policy making and this whole program has been designed to enable citizens to have a say in science and technology policy. So I looked at 10 years worth. So I use a big data, big text analysis approach, so computational approaches to text analysis, and I looked at reports from the UK government-funded dialogue events, so ScienceWise, analogous expert reports from learned societies, and government policy reports, so all on the same subject. Typically, the public dialogue would feed into a learned society, which would feed in to a specific policy document. And what I did was look at the kind of discourses within these to try and map where discourses go and where they're shared. And basically what I found is quite different ways of thinking about science and technology within society. So, I mean, typically, the expert and the policy discourses were remarkably similar to one another, and they typically saw uncertainty as something, a question that needs to be managed, and risk that needs to be managed. Whereas the public saw it as inevitable, that science and technology creates uncertainty and unforeseeable circumstances. For them, it was very much a question of just learning to live with that and figuring out whether that level of uncertainty was sufficient for the benefits. And so bringing them together, I tend to describe them, so this has actually been published in a paper called Science to the Rescue. So this elite imaginary, which is shared by scientists and policymakers, I think is one which is very familiar to us. And I sort of illustrate it with a gap that needs to be jumped over. So it's the idea that science solves problems, it brings us good things. Any problems in the world, or any problems which occur as a result of science, simply are matters that need to be filled with more knowledge and more science. Whereas for the public, I show it with this rope that's fraying, that the kind of downsides and the uncertainties and the problems which come with science and technology are seen very much as integral parts to science and technology. And for them, if you say, we'll separate off the social and ethical issues and we'll manage those, that's a risk management thing, we can do that, that lacks any credibility, because for them, the whole being of the technology has been broken. So they see the downsides and the uncertainties as basically the same, another side of the same coin. And so part of the problems that we look at, I think, comes from this. So first of all, I would argue that this is kind of more of a post-normal view of things, or I said it in my earlier slide, that it was more like the Beck and Giddens description of manufactured uncertainty. I think that what the public are describing are a slightly more nuanced and sophisticated perspective on things than perhaps is expressed by scientists and policymakers. So we've got these kind of two imaginaries of science which are sufficiently different to cause problems. And what I found is that there's very little evidence of this public imaginary in any of the policy statements, and very little impact of any of the public discourses having any effect whatsoever in the policy statements. Okay, so I then wanted to, my question is, how does, this imaginary of science to the rescue is very, very enduring, and, everyone I talk to, scientists are very comfortable expressing that. So where does this come from, and how is it so stabilized within a policy situation? And I think, there's been a lot of work in science and technology studies, so McNaughton and Chilvers and Wynne has done lots, and they're arguing that there's something about the institutions and the people within them that's kind of holding this together. And I've got to say that I have a problem with this account. To me, this is the beginning of a research project, not the conclusion of one. So, I was quite sort of affected by reading Latour's assessing, Reassembling the Social. So his argument is that social ties are weak. So these inequalities and these perspectives simply can't be maintained by individuals and values and, just people, there has to be something that's cementing them. And obviously his argument is that non-human actants are doing that. So my question was, you know, what is it that's stabilizing these, this particular imaginary of science and innovation, despite many attempts to disrupt it and change it? So I did a series of interviews with UK ministers, civil service, civil servants and chief scientific advisors. And first of all, I found lots of evidence that, well, the conclusion is that I couldn't, that the machinery of policymaking can't accommodate these nuanced views. So to begin, I found that it was clear that these kind of soft, the soft social ties are very clearly there. So to begin with, the elite imaginary, so particularly this idea that risks and uncertainties are things which can be taken away and managed elsewhere, leaving the science intact, is really deeply embedded in how even public opinion is heard. So it's acting as a filter that's kind of changing how the public hear things. I think I've got a quote. Yeah, I should have left that. So, you know, this is from a former chief scientific advisor. It's really important. He was talking about why we need to do public dialogue, because if we understand what people care about, we can then think it through and address their issues and work out what research questions, you know, what research we need to do less, which is just a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Okay. It also is really shaping what is considered to be expertise. So, you know, there's this story was really interesting. So this was a former colleague of mine who was being quite candid, and he was telling me a story about a minister he'd worked with on GM policy, and all of the experts that the civil servants had brought in were scientific experts on GM who were saying it was safe, and this minister brought in his own expert who didn't think it was safe. And I mean, to me, this was pretty clear what was going on here, but the civil servant was absolutely outraged by this and just was saying how difficult this minister was, and was saying, you know, they had a particular view of what the evidence showed, and they weren't open to alternative experts who challenged that view. So, you know, I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the civil servant is criticising the minister for having a bit more of a post-normal or a more nuanced perspective on what the evidence was saying, when the civil servant just wanted him to understand that science will rescue us and that we just separate the social and ethical issues and it'll all be fine. So he was saying, you know, this is ridiculous. They're not even experts because they don't hold this science to the rescue view. We don't want them in our building. But beyond that, I think that what I saw in the interviews when they were describing other situations, and I'll show a couple of slides, is that it really was a machine that, even when people stopped thinking about how they wanted to process things, they had no choice but to separate out the social and ethical issues from the science. And so what's happening is that this elite imaginary, regardless of what individuals think, is both being manufactured by the decision-making process and perpetuated through it. So how am I doing for time?
You still have 7 or 8.
Yeah, okay, good, I'm doing good. So firstly, what was absolutely clear is that the primacy of... Yeah, I'm not in a hurry. It's good. I've timed it right. The primacy of scientific evidence in parliamentary and European decision-making is really, really forcing this. And so this was another civil servant who was explaining, I said, why are you not taking account of what the public say? And I explained what I'd found. And he said, well, you could say that the public dialogue, in the sense of, you know, being public opinion, had a very strong effect on policy where it could. And then again, talking about GM policy, but then when you had this European framework that was very strictly linked to the scientific evidence, then the government was playing with a very straight bat and voting where the direction of the scientific evidence was pointing. And what came to light in this conversation is that there'd been a big public debate in the UK about GM crops, and the public had largely rejected it, and the UK government had said, okay, that means that we can't really do it. However, within the European Commission, the same government had been arguing for GM crops. And this was their explanation, was that, well, the public was, you know, this social and ethical stuff, and that cannot be taken into account in European decision-making. So, you know, we had to do what the science tells us to do, and that was arguing for it, which I think was a very interesting, and I don't think I've put the quote in here, but there were other stories which I was told. So a chief scientist repeated a story that on biofuels, one of the ministers, the transport minister, said to him, I think the policy in Europe is really wrong on biofuels. We've got a huge problem because it looks as if agricultural land for food is being taken out of production and is having an impact on hunger in developing countries. So I want to oppose it, but I understand that I can't oppose it on the grounds of being upset about people in developing countries. So please go away and find some scientific evidence that will allow me to oppose the biofuels policy within the European Commission. And the chief scientist told me with great delight how he had gone away and solved that problem by coming up with some scientific evidence which showed that biofuels were rubbish. So, yeah. Huh? Yeah, but it was kind of interesting that this minister felt powerless to do what she felt was the right thing when you know that was the strategy that they took, was to concoct some alternative scientific evidence to back up their values. I don't think I showed that right. Okay, so then I just love this one as well. So then it became clear that. The way that agencies and schemes of delegation, so who gets to decide what, was set up, has really, really put this elite imaginary front and centre, and actually quite deliberately. So another former chief scientist said to me, he was talking about, they're all men, by the way, so I don't feel that I'm revealing too much by saying he. And they never mentioned any women, we don't exist. So he was talking about the ash cloud, you know, this Icelandic cloud, and he was kind of boasting that he'd sorted this out. And he said the science dominated because the Civil Aviation Authority were given the responsibility of saying this thing can be where we fly. So basically he's saying that the Civil Aviation Authority were given responsibility for deciding, which kept it away from ministers. So ministers had no decision-making power on this because, you know, who knows what would happen if they got involved. They talk to the public and they are concerned about other things. So what we did is to make sure that the scientists got to make the decisions. We set up the institution in this way so that the decision is over there and no one else's business. So that's kind of interesting. So again, instantly, the social and ethical issues and the value stuff has to be separated from the technical stuff by this scheme of delegation, because the Civil Aviation Authority has no way of accounting for more values-based things. And then my last one is the least interesting, but probably the most important, is that it was also really clear that the justice system, which others have written about their use of scientific evidence and the threat of a judicial review on every decision was a really big motivator. And this quote is talking about bovine TB, which I'm not sure everyone is as aware. It's the most interesting science policy topic at the moment to me. And this former minister told the story that they had to follow the scientific evidence, even though they knew people were upset about badgers being killed. They couldn't do anything other than follow the science because they knew they were going to get a judicial review on this, and the courts would only uphold scientific evidence. The courts would not accept any emotional or ethical or social evidence. So, there's a whole lot worth discussing in that quote, but that's simply the point that I'm trying to make, is that, again, this minister felt unable to express anything other than technical decision-making because of the scrutiny that they were likely to undergo through the justice process. So, I mean, I think the kind of big lesson is that there really is very little room for values, for social, ethical issues to be taken into account of, or for the public to be listened to in policymaking. And this is a real headline. This was a headline the 24th of June 2016. And, you know, everyone laughed at it. But I kind of feel some sympathy that the man who voted leave to leave the European Union said he thought wouldn't count and is now worried. So, you know, we hear these stories of people who, you know, they haven't been listened to for decades and they do something terrible and then they're shocked when they are listened. So, and I think that's kind of my last point, is that it really does matter if we're building a system that is ignoring people. And just to go back, so this is my roundabout in West London again, the roundabout's here. This is a kind of planner's drawing. The reason you can tell it's a planner's drawing is the sun is shining. It doesn't ever look like that. This is Imperial College's tower. This is the planner's drawing of what the Imperial College campus will look like. And to me, this really sort of shows the problem that we've got, is those 4 towers there. This tower people might be more familiar with. It's the Grenfell Tower, that even now I've got goose pimples looking at that. So, you know, 78 people died in their beds because they were living in housing that was neglected and nobody cared about. You know, and I think if we're building glass towers of knowledge and centres of science that are on the doorstep of people who are dying of poverty, how can we be surprised when people are angry about the world that science is building that they're not part of? And if anyone is not working on evidence and is not being rational, I question which way round we should be pointing. Is it the ordinary citizens, or is it the people who are going to be occupying these glass towers? Now, I don't mean this a criticism of Imperial, because most universities are doing the same. It's just, it's my neighbourhood, they're my people. And, you know, I just think that this is a really kind of stark and shocking example of illustration of what I'm talking about. So, of all of the discussions, I think, I'm really sorry to have that horrible picture again. You know, a lot of people have left with the Brexit debate in the UK with a memory of this, we've had enough of experts. But actually, if we're going to learn anything from it, it's this slogan, let's take back control, that really has the power, I think, to make us think about how we assert our values and rational thoughts in the world. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.